Welcome to Pleasureology Island, where your natural biological sex drive will always find a sympathetic home. I'm Freethought Steve, the lone pleasureologist. Welcome back to the Sex Positive Seminar for Humanistic Sexual Psychology. What is humanistic sexual psychology? It's an exploration of the ways in which we can, all of us, as individuals and as partners, the ways in which all of us can learn how to fully actualize our own personal potential for sexual pleasure. Let me repeat that with hopefully fewer interruptions. Humanistic sexual psychology attempts to help us learn how we can fully actualize, or how we can actualize our full potential for sexual pleasure. A potential needs to be actualized. The potential exists in our body, but especially in our brain, and especially in the circuits of our emotional brain. The sexual circuits of our emotional brain, that's where sexual arousal begins. Sexual arousal doesn't begin in our sex organs. Sexual arousal begins in our emotional brain. And sexual arousal is one of our basic emotions. Hunger is a basic emotion, laughter is a basic emotion, crying is a basic emotion, anger is a basic emotion, fear is a basic emotion, and sexual arousal is one of the basic emotions that can be produced by our emotional brain. And our emotional brain's nerve circuits for producing sexual arousal mature fully at the time of puberty, when our sex gonads, that would be our testes and our ovaries, begin to produce sex hormones that go from the testes into the bloodstream, from the ovaries into the bloodstream. And through the bloodstream, they are carried up to the brain, and these hormones bathe the brain, and in so doing, they activate the genetic mechanisms in the cell bodies of our nerve cells, the nerve cells that form the sexual arousal circuits, so that those nerve cells within the nerve circuits that produce sexual arousal become fully mature, they connect with one another, and they become responsive to sexual stimulation from the outside. Now, we've been moderately responsive to sexual stimuli from the outside throughout our entire lives. In the childhood period from 3 to 7 and then on up, we can become sexually aroused, we can become sexually interested in things, and so those nerve circuits are already operating. We can have erections and sexual arousal when we're children, but those same nerve circuits fully develop at puberty when when the brain is bathed in sexual hormones. And so it's at that point when our body becomes spontaneously sexually aroused by situations, persons, and events in the environment that trigger the sexiness-recognition centers of our emotional brain to say, oh yeah, I recognize this as a sexy situation. I recognize this as a sexy person. And I recognize that, if we were to take our clothes off together and look at each other's bodies, that would be a sexy thing to do. That's our first sexual impulse as children. And that continues to be a sexual impulse at puberty. It becomes even more powerful, fantasies about taking off our clothes and being with someone naked who matches the sexiness recognition template in our emotional brain, that will arouse our sexual arousal circuits in our emotional brain. The sexiness recognition centers will say, yeah, this is a match for my inborn, innate definition of a person who is sexy and a situation that is a sexy situation and an activity that's a sexy activity. When we can match one of the templates, and there are many templates in our emotional brain, when we can match one of those templates, or two or three of them at the same time, our sexiness recognition center tells the emotional brain, yeah, this is a situation that deserves the emotional response of becoming sexually aroused. And then the emotional brain will go ahead and send emotional output. You see, the outside stimulation is emotional input. The sexy stimulation is emotional input that our sexiness recognition centers recognize. And then our emotional brain sends emotional output, sexiness output, sexual arousal output. And where does it send that output? It sends it down the nerves of the autonomic nervous system to the blood vessels, the arteries that allow blood to flow into the sex organs. And it opens up those blood vessels so that the heart can pump blood easily into our sex organs, which creates erection of the penis, erection of the clitoris, and vaginal lubrication. All of these things occur because the emotional brain sends nerve impulses down the autonomic nervous system, a particular branch of the nervous system that goes to the sex organs to cause physical sexual arousal by allowing blood to flow into our sexual organs. At the same time, the emotional brain sends emotional output to consciousness, so that in our consciousness, we get an emotional feeling of being sexually turned on. This is a euphoric feeling. It's a pleasurable feeling. It's a delightful feeling. It's a nice feeling. It's a feeling we enjoy. And at the same time, we get sexual urges. We get the urge to do something sexy in response to the sexual situation that has turned us on to begin with. For instance, taking one's clothes off and showing one's body to someone who is sexy, who is perhaps already showing their body to us. And so that's the sort of thing that when my mom was showing her body in a sexy way to me when I was 11 years old, 12 years old, and had just hit puberty, just started having orgasms, which she knew about because she was changing my sheets every week, washing my sheets, and could see the semen stains all over my mattress. And so she knew that and she'd seen my penis erect, at lunchtime a year or so earlier when she pulled down my pants, thinking that I was trying to scratch a patch of dry skin on my crotch, whereas in fact I was trying to make room for my expanding penis inside a pair of tight blue jeans. And so when she pulled down my pants to investigate, out popped my erection. This was when I was about probably 10 and a half years old, not quite 11. And so she knew that I was already having erections, and then she saw the semen stains on my mattress, and so she knew that I was masturbating and I was ejaculating every night, and so she found it erotically exciting for herself to allow me to catch her in states of undress or half dress, walking around just in a pair of panties, nice pair of white panties, but topless, walking around the house wearing just a bra, no panties at all, which was even more a turn on to me because I really focused on my mom's pubic area. Although I had seen her naked over the years, but now that I, was learning to give myself orgasms at night, I had become much more interested in my mother's body, the only female body that I had personal access to seeing, the only female body I had the opportunity to see. And so she was enjoying giving me sexual stimulation. She had started doing this back in her own teen years with her brothers at home, and then had done it with my father for a while after they were first married. Even though they weren't having sex, she enjoyed teasing him by walking around in transparent lingerie of different types, which made him masturbate, which made him guilty because he was a minister and he wasn't supposed to do that, which gave him a duodenal ulcer in his stomach. But anyway, that was her way of having fun. She was trapped in a marriage. She couldn't divorce my father. You can't divorce a minister. It'll ruin his career. She felt that social conventions would be too shocked. And my mother was unfortunately never one to want to shock social conventions. She was a rebel in private. So she was a rebel around the house, but she didn't want to shock social conventions by divorcing my father. But then my father gets arrested in the UCLA library for looking up a girl's skirt with a pocket mirror under the table, when he's in his mid-30s and he's looking up, 20-year-old college co-ed skirts with a pocket mirror. So he gets arrested. And so this becomes a shameful thing that's now known in the Presbyterian church circles in Hollywood where they were living at the time. And all of a sudden, my father's an outcast from that society. And he, to make amends for that, starts going off to India to try and convert the heathen and go far and far away from his sexual shame at home, the scandal that had happened. But my mom has basically given up on him, so she has boyfriends in Los Angeles for a couple of years, and then my father comes back from India, and he finds out about her boyfriends probably. So he moves the family up to a smaller city outside of Los Angeles, about an hour and a half away. And there my mom, she can go to the beach. We have a private beach that's just a couple miles from our house. So she can go down to the beach and show herself off and exhibit herself at the beach. But she can't get naked anywhere except in the house. And of course, when beach season ends at the end of the summer, she's sort of confined to the house, and so her exhibitionism finds an outlet in the house by her letting me see her naked and in lingerie around the house. And then one day, my dad sees semen stains on my sheets that she's about to wash, and he knows, he realizes that I've been masturbating, and so he comes into my room and tells me this has got to stop, and shows me the part of the sheet that has nose boogers on it, instead of showing me the semen stains, because he's too embarrassed about masturbation to even show me what it is that he wants me to stop doing. So I don't get the message. I think he just wants me to stop rubbing my nose boogers on the sheet, so I rub them from then on a Kleenex on the nightstand, no problem. But then he realizes that still he hasn't gotten through to me. He still can't talk to me about it. He can't say anything to me about masturbation, about what it is and why I should stop it. But he has a little book he's going to give me full of sort of sex-negative Christian attitudes that he gives me that makes me believe now that God hates masturbation, and I'm letting Jesus down by masturbating, and that I'm out of control, and I've got to stop this, basically. So he ruins my fun that way. But I just wanted to, he didn't stop my fun. Of course, he's not going to stop my biological sex drive, which has by now learned how much fun orgasms are and how pleasurable they are. And so my brain has developed an appetite for the pleasure of sexual stimulation and orgasm. And it's like hunger and the desire for food. Our brain has developed an appetite for food, and when you're hungry, it's not going to let you forget that fact. As long as you stay hungry, food is going to be popping into your mind as an object of desire. And so The same way with the hunger for the pleasure of orgasm, the option of masturbating is always going to come back into my mind, and as a way to experience that pleasure of orgasm, even though my father has now told me that God doesn't want me to do that. And so now I am in a conflict, an emotional conflict situation that is going to last for the next 3 years, 3 or 4 years, until he finally gets some marriage counseling, because my mom's divorcing him to marry someone else. And my dad has to go through marriage counseling as part of the process of getting a divorce back in the 1960s, 1964. It was a long, drawn-out process. It was hard to get a divorce. And you had to go to counseling first in order to try and make the marriage work before the state would allow you to break the marriage up and marry someone else. So that was a good thing for my father, because the marriage counselor, said to him, "Listen, masturbation isn't that a big a deal. It's just something that everybody does, basically, and it doesn't harm anybody, and you shouldn't think of it as being anything sinful or wrong morally." And so that, in turn, prompted my father to tell me one day when he was driving me to school one morning in the 10th grade. By now I'm 15 years old, so this is like 3.5 years later, to tell me there's nothing wrong with masturbation. It's okay, it's fine, which was a great relief to me. But there were 3.5 years there when he had me believing that I was a terrible, terrible sinner for masturbating, for satisfying my natural biological sex drive. And that 3 years of anxiety and guilt combined together changed my personality. My personality, and this is true of all of us in our early teenage years, our personalities are forming themselves at that time. And so the emotional attitudes that we develop during these critical years of personality development, right after puberty, are permanent changes. The nerve circuits in our brain actually are physically changed when we spend a lot of our time in anxiety and guilt and fear and shame and self-shame, which is what would happen to me every time I masturbated. And I would try as hard as I could not to masturbate again. And I would say to myself, "Oh, I'm just going to give myself a little bit of pleasure, but by this time, but I'm not going to have an orgasm. I'll give myself pleasure, but I'm not going to have an orgasm." And by this time, I had changed. I needed to be more covert with my masturbation because I felt guilty about it and didn't want to get caught by it. So instead of rubbing my penis on the mattress and imagining I was rubbing it on my mother's naked stomach, instead I turned my penis downward alongside my thigh and was holding it alongside my thigh inside my pajama pants, and rubbing my penis against my thigh, rubbing my thigh against my penis. It's called the thigh friction method of masturbation. And then I would jack off into my pajama pants. And I would say to myself, okay, I'm just going to rub my penis against my thigh a little bit, and just enjoy that, but I'm not going to have an orgasm. And then I would start fantasizing. And by now, I was fantasizing about lots of women other than my mother, but mostly full-grown women. I didn't fantasize at that time about girls my own age. None of them was doing anything sexy enough. I had crushes on girls my own age. I fell in love with girls in my school class, all the time. And I had a series of passionate crushes on different girls in my 8th grade class. But I never masturbated thinking about them. I only masturbated thinking about women who were showing me their bodies in some kind of a sexy way, whether it be in a tennis skirt with white panties or a bikini by the poolside. And in those days, bikinis were much more modest than they are now, but nevertheless, they were still form-fitting. So seeing a woman in a bikini was a sexually stimulating idea. Hearing about my friend Ken's two sisters, 16 and 17 years old or something, walking around his house in their underwear, and him being able to see them. And I could, relate to that easily because I saw my mom walking around the house in her underwear and less. So just the thought of Ken telling me that, and then I could visualize that in my mind. I have a good visual imagination, and so I could visualize his sisters walking around the house in their underwear, and that would get me turned on enough as I'm rubbing my penis against my thigh. My penis is getting harder and harder, and then eventually all of a sudden it just feels too good to stop, and I've just got to go on and give myself an orgasm, and I give myself an orgasm, and whatever woman I'm fantasizing about, I'm saying, oh, I love you, as I have my orgasm, and then immediately afterwards, in our brain, the nerve circuits change rapidly right after an orgasm for a man, and it feels like your whole energy level drops, your interest in sex becomes zero. And at that point of low energy, which is just a natural physiological thing that happens in the brain after a male orgasm, there's no point the male continuing to be sexually aroused. He has shot his wad, literally. He has delivered the contents of his seminal vesicles somewhere. and so biologically, since his penis has shot all of its semen out, there's no point in him continuing to be sexually aroused. So evolution has designed our brains, the male brain, so that it immediately loses interest in sex. And it immediately feels like, oh, I'm never going to be interested in sex again. I'm never going to want to have another orgasm again. I just had one. Now I feel really guilty about it because God saw me have it. Jesus saw me have it. They know I've been a sinner, and I've had an orgasm and expelled my semen, and I feel guilty. I feel sinful. I feel ashamed of myself, and I have to beg their forgiveness. I have to beg the forgiveness of God and Jesus, and promise that I will never ever do this again. And when I make that promise, I'm 100% sincere, because right after a man has had an orgasm, it's very easy to promise that I'll never be sexually active again, because all sexual desire has drained away from consciousness. And it's very easy to imagine never needing to have another orgasm in your life. And so I would always make that promise, and then I would break it again the next night or the next morning or whenever. And so I went through this constant cycle of feeling guilty and sinful all the time for 3.5 years, from the age of 12 on up to 15 and a half, let's say, when my father finally said, oh, by the way, there's nothing wrong with masturbation, so forget what I told you 3.5 years ago. But my emotional brain believed that at the time. And it continued to believe that because I continued to be religious. So it's not that easy to all of a sudden say to your emotional brain, oh, it's okay now to masturbate. It got rid of like a superficial level of sexual guilt, but not a deep level of sexual guilt. And it didn't get rid of the changes in my personality that had occurred because of 3.5 years of feeling ashamed of myself and also feeling anxious, constantly anxious that somebody would find out that I was a masturbator, and I would be ashamed in front of everybody. And so there, when you are anxious and guilty, our emotional brain sends out tension into the body, throughout the whole body. It tenses up our muscles. It tenses up our internal organs. It changes the balance of our internal organs functioning. We can have all kinds of problems. Heart rate can get too high, high blood pressure, or stomach problems. It changes the balance of antibodies in our bloodstream because it changes our immune system. The autonomic nervous system affects our entire body. And so when the emotional brain is in a chronic state of anxiety or guilt and shame about oneself, then that does bad things to our entire body. There's not a cell in our body that is unaffected by that. Every cell in our body is affected by the changes that our emotional brain brings about in our autonomic nervous system and in our hormone system throughout our entire body, and in our immune system and in our brain, because we want to run away from the awareness of ourself as a sinful, shameful person, guilty person. And one way we can run away from ourselves is by thinking obsessively, ruminating and fantasizing obsessively. We lose ourselves. That was when I really started reading a lot and losing myself in my reading, because I would be less anxious if I was lost in an imaginary world that I was reading about, rather than just being aware of myself in reality. I didn't want to be aware of the anxiety and guilt that I was feeling. I wanted to lose my awareness of myself. And so that made me much more inward turned, introspective. And that was a permanent change in my personality that didn't go away when my father told me, oh, by the way, I was wrong when I told you 3.5 years ago that masturbation was a terrible sin and God and Jesus hate you for it. Okay. And he didn't really go into a big deal about it, because he wasn't even thoroughly convinced himself until a decade later. He told me that actually a Catholic priest that he roomed with for a while, or that he was in the same house with, the Catholic priest was a young guy who was more liberated. He says, and he convinced my dad that masturbation was just a normal thing. We shouldn't even worry about it. But that was way later. So, he'd given me some heavy propaganda with that little book, and then he sort of halfway erased it 3.5 years later by saying, don't worry, masturbation's okay. But that didn't undo the habit of chronic anxiety, the habit of chronic shame, and the habit of chronic guilt that I had inside myself, that I had spent 3.5 years hiding from the outside world, hiding my feelings from the outside world, pretending to the outside world that I was innocent and pure and I never did a one wrong thing in my life. I always tried to look like I'd never ever done one wrong thing. And it was just a big lie. So sexual shame and guilt causes us to develop a phony personality, a false personality that we then put forward to the rest of the world. And we soon forget that we're putting on this act. And we forget, we successfully manage to hide our own shame, anxiety, and guilt from ourselves. And we act like everything's perfectly normal, and we believe everything's perfectly normal most of the time. But what we've done is we've repressed our feelings. We've cut ourselves off from our true feelings about ourselves. And so what I realized when I grew up and started getting high on cannabis and started being aware of my consciousness and aware of my feelings, aware of myself. The psychedelics, I took LSD a few times, and the psychedelics, including cannabis, make us much more aware of what's actually going on in our own consciousness. And so I began to be more aware of the amount of anxiety that I had. I began to be aware that, I was not relaxed, but I didn't know how to get relaxed. I didn't even know that it was possible to get relaxed. Everybody kept saying, well, if you really want to, you can be as high on acid as you are on acid without using drugs. You can get to the same place without using drugs. But that was always just a bunch of wishful thinking. Nobody I knew ever did. And of course, you can't have the same euphoric high without psychedelics that we can with psychedelics, because psychedelics are a very real chemical that we introduce into our brain that really activates certain receptor sites and activates the dopamine circuits, activates the serotonin circuits, activates the opiate circuits. All of these circuits get activated by the psychedelics in one way or another, so they do, in fact, change consciousness. In a way that you can't do just by thinking about it or imagining that it will happen. But what we can do, with the help of cannabis particularly, what we can do is we can learn how to undo the chronic tension and anxiety that we've been feeling if we learn relaxation techniques, which include emotional release techniques. It's not just calming down emotion, but also emotional release techniques and muscular relaxation techniques, as well as emotional relaxation, so that we can calm down our emotional brain. Because of our chronic sexual tensions and conflicts, guilt and shame and anxiety, our emotional brain has developed a habit of operating our anxiety circuits, which then make our anger circuits much touchier, much more liable to go off. Being anxious and feeling guilty and ashamed makes us much more irritable, much more easily angered. And so these are habits that, and we don't know why we get angry so easily. We don't connect it with the emotional tension that comes from having to hide the fact that we masturbate and that we're guilty about it. But in fact, that's what's happening, is that inner tension is making us more irritable and more easily angered. And this is something that we can't just change by intellectually saying, okay, I don't have to feel ashamed about my sexuality anymore, or anxious about it, or guilty about it. So I'm not going to feel that way. No, our emotional brain already has developed the habit of operating the anxiety nerve circuits, the anger nerve circuits, the shame nerve circuits, the guilt nerve circuits, and we have to learn new habits. We have to teach our emotional brain new habits of being emotionally calm and actually feeling calm from head to toe. It's a psychophysical process because it involves our body as well. We have to learn how to relax our body, calm down our autonomic nervous system, our breathing and our heart rate and everything else. Relax all the muscles from head to toe. We have to learn how to not be obsessed with thoughts. We have to learn how to not run away from the present moment by being so caught up in our own thoughts that we're really living in a fantasy world. So that's where Zen meditation is good, because Zen is the art of learning how to clear our mind of thoughts for short periods of time and just focus exclusively on what we are experiencing in the here and now moment, the world around us, as well as the feelings we have inside our body, and not get lost in elaborate trains of thought and fantasy. So that was what I learned to do starting in 1972 at the Pinecrest Summer Drama Workshop, where our teachers taught us all these muscular relaxing exercises and some yoga stretches. And I got the idea of doing Tai Chi, which is very calming. You move very slowly, because one of the things about anxiety is that it makes us move very rapidly. But Tai Chi allows us to move very slowly and calmly. And so I began a process of gradually reshaping my whole organism from the emotional brain outward in order to calm down my emotions, relax my muscles, and get control over the thought stream, the stream of thoughts flowing through my brain consciously. And so I began to be able to clear out my consciousness of thoughts, have my body nice and relaxed, have all of my internal organs nice and calm, have my emotional brain nice and calm, and learn how not to broadcast anxiety from my emotional brain down into my body. And once I learned how to do all of these relaxing, calming things, then getting high became way more pleasurable. All of a sudden, it was like, wow, getting high on cannabis, I could be as calm as previously I needed to take LSD in order to get that calm. Whenever I would take LSD, I would get completely calm. But now I could get calm like that, just getting high on cannabis. And I was able to feel my whole body so much better. I was able to enjoy being in my own consciousness and being in my own body in a way that I couldn't remember ever enjoying before. So it's possible to undo the effects of the negative emotional learning that sexual shame and sexual anxiety creates in our emotional system during our early years of puberty. But in order to do that, one of the things that we need to do is become completely comfortable with whatever favorite sexual turn-ons we happen to have learned during that critical period of sexual learning, early, right after puberty and onwards. Whatever those, see, our emotional brain during those years will opportunistically get turned on by whatever the sexiest stimulation from the environment happens to be, the sexiest person and the sexiest situations and the sexiest activities, whatever they happen to be. Our emotional brain will recognize those situations as sexy, will lay down a strong memory of those situations, and in the future, when we're in similar situations, those sexual memories, strong memories of arousal and orgasm, will make us easily aroused by situations that resemble the situations that turned us on the most when we were first learning to get turned on and have orgasms. And what we have to do in order to be completely calm with our own sexuality, be completely at home with every sexual impulse and urge and desire that we have, so that we're not afraid of them, is to accept these early turn-ons, which are still very powerful turn-ons, and perhaps the most powerful turn-ons that our emotional brain will have throughout our life. These early turn-ons, we have to accept them as part of our ongoing sexual nature and not feel ashamed of them. because if we feel ashamed of our turn-ons, then when we're in a situation that turns us on in that way, but we're ashamed of it, then we have to push that sexual arousal, we have to push that image, whatever it is that is turning us on, out of our mind. We have to repress it. And by doing that, we interrupt, we block our natural sexual arousal process. And we may lose our sexual arousal because we're having to thrust out of our mind some sexually arousing idea or fantasy that we feel ashamed of. That's why it's important for us to learn to not be ashamed of our sexual fantasies, whatever they happen to be. And in my case, of course, these would be fantasies involving my mother and involving her showing me her body in a very sexy way, and me being turned on by that and masturbating about that and having an orgasm about that. Having an orgasm while thinking about her showing her body to me in a sexy way. And now our society, the old school cultural tradition of sexual shame that we've inherited from 2,000 years of mystical thinking and sex negative religion, our whole society says, oh, a boy should not be sexually turned on by his mother. A boy should not be sexually turned on by his sister. A boy should not be sexually turned on by his father or his brother or anyone in the family. And yet, because we live in nuclear families, we live in small families, and that's where we are in the most intimate contact with other human beings, and these are the human beings we feel most socially comfortable with. It is natural that if we have a family member who happens to activate and match the sexiness template in our emotional brain's sexiness recognition centers, then we are going to feel sexual arousal in response to that particular person. And we're going to feel sexual feelings for them. And our emotional brain does not care whether they're a family member or not. That's a sort of an intellectual concept that our emotional brain isn't really concerned with. That is, our sexiness recognition centers aren't concerned with it. The social centers of our emotional brain are concerned about whether the sexual arousal that we feel for a family member would be approved or disapproved of by other people. There's a part of our emotional brain that is the socially sensitive part of our emotional brain that worries about what will other people think? What would they say if they knew that I had sexy feelings for my mother or my sister or my father or my brother or my cousin or my aunt or my uncle? The emotional part of our emotional brain, the social part of our emotional brain that cares about what other people think and cares, everybody believes that it's wrong for me to feel sexually attracted to my mother. Then I'm going to have an emotional conflict. My sexiness recognition centers are still going to be turned on by my mom if she's walking around the house naked or in, sexy lingerie or something like that. The sexiness recognition centers are going to make me become sexually aroused, but then my social awareness centers are going to make me want to stop that arousal. And so I will have a conflict. And I may succeed in totally suppressing my sexual arousal to my mother or to my sister or whoever. I may succeed in totally inhibiting that sexual arousal. But then that's not a good thing to learn either. because that then can interfere with our sexual arousal later on. And the only way we can feel holy, the only way we can feel pure or like a good person, is to suppress those feelings that society says are wrong. And so then when we grow up, we've got these feelings, these memories that we've buried and repressed and denied and refused to allow into our consciousness. But if we're in a sexual situation with someone else, and something about that situation brings up the memory of some sexy interaction with a member of our family, or some sexy desire that we had for a member of our family, that if it comes back into consciousness while we're being sexually active with someone else and being sexually aroused with someone else, then we may have to then our anxiety comes up again, our shame comes up, and we have to try and push that out of our mind, and that will interrupt our arousal with the person that we're with. Unless we're very successful, we keep it out of our mind, and we really focus strongly and intensely on staying focused on the person that we're being sexually active with, but keeping that out of our mind. What we've got there is the problem of tense sexuality. We don't have relaxed sexuality because we have the tension of trying to keep these forbidden ideas out of consciousness. And this kind of tense sexuality prevents what I call super euphoric sex, the expansion of sexual bliss throughout consciousness, and then full consciousness orgasms afterwards. In order to attain these super euphoric sexual experiences, we have to be simultaneously emotionally relaxed, unconflicted, no tension in our emotional brain, but also the emotional brain is aroused and turned on. So the sexual arousal circuits are firing, but the anxiety and tension circuits are calm, because we're not afraid of any of our sexual wishes or desires, no matter what they happen to be. If a memory of my mother comes into my mind, and a memory of masturbating, looking at my mother, or thinking about looking at my mother when she's naked comes into my mind while I'm having sex with someone else, with a partner, that's all right. I let it into my mind. I let it add to my arousal instead of diminishing my arousal, because I don't have to fight it. I don't have to split my attention between fighting off the forbidden idea and focusing on the partner that I'm with. I can allow that idea, which society would say is forbidden, and I can say, no, there's nothing that I should feel ashamed about, because my emotional brain got sexually aroused by my mother because she happened to be the most sexually arousing person in my environment. She was the only woman who I saw in person and live, naked and in her lingerie, and letting me see her, deliberately letting me see her in sexy outfits, or walking around the house, or standing in her bedroom in front of the mirror, admiring herself in that beautiful outfit with high heels and stockings and a garter belt and a bra, and I think she had gloves on, I don't know if she had a hat on even. I mean, she could leave her hat on. The one thing that she didn't leave on was her panties. And so she was admiring herself in the mirror, looking as sexy as possible with no panties on, but all the rest of this lingerie. Where she stood was when I came out of my bedroom, it was right there. And so she was waiting for me to come out, and she just needed me to see her just for a moment or two. And then she knew that she had given me a view of her beautiful body. And she only wished that I could come to her and tell her, Mom, I think you have a beautiful body. That's all she wanted to hear. so that she would know that I was thinking about her, and she could think about me thinking about her, and she could have an orgasm thinking about me having an orgasm thinking about her, and everybody would be happy. If I say, okay, there's no reason that for me to feel ashamed about that. That was an absolutely natural thing for my emotional brain to get turned on by, because I was living in a society that was depriving me of naked women elsewhere. Back in 1960, there were no strip clubs, there were no movies showing naked women, there were no R-rated movies at all. Everything was PG, at worst PG-13. Very, very little sexual stimulation in the outside environment, but here in my house, nothing could be sexier than my mom looking like a modern-day version of Aphrodite, the ancient Greek goddess of love and sexuality, a blonde Aphrodite in my own house, walking around naked. How is my emotional brain not going to get turned on by that? If my sexiness recognition centers are genetically programmed to recognize a naked woman as a sexy object. If I had a sexual recognition template for naked men instead of naked women, then my mom would have had no effect on me. I wouldn't have become sexually aroused by her. But because I did have a heterosexual sexiness recognition center, it was absolutely inevitable that my brain would become turned on by this beautiful, sexy woman, displaying herself in the sexiest costumes that she could imagine, that she could come up with, and walking around the house that way, or standing in front of her mirror, where I would see her when I came out of my bedroom. There is only one reason that there are sexual taboos in society. The reason for that is that that we naturally get turned on by those things. All right, there's a taboo against adultery, against having sex with someone else's wife or husband. Okay, why is there a taboo against that? It's because it's natural for human beings to want to do that. And if there's no prohibition against having sex with someone else's spouse, then people will do it. And they will do it even if there is a prohibition against it. They'll just have to be more secretive about it. But the only reason that there's a prohibition against it is because it's a natural human tendency to want to have sex with a variety of people, with a new, fresh partner every so often. That's just a natural part of human nature. And that's why there's a taboo against having sex with somebody else's spouse, in order to keep the peace in society. Because if there is no such taboo, then the spouse that's getting cheated on becomes jealous and angry, and there's violence within the social group. So in order to keep peace within the social group, there's an official prohibition against adultery, which doesn't mean that it doesn't go on, but at least it keeps it secretive enough that it minimizes the amount of actual conflict between spouses and lovers. And I'm not saying that is something that should not be prohibited. I think that it all depends on the individual case, that who is doing what. And I do think that nowadays, given the epidemic of STDs, I think that if I am having sex with anybody, whether it's my partner or whether it's a wife or a temporary partner or something, if I'm having sex with one person, I have their sexual health in my hands, in my responsibility. It's my responsibility to take care of their sexual health by not having sex with anybody on the side where I could catch an STD and then pass it on to my primary partner. So I am very much in favor of monogamous relationships. They don't have to be lifelong monogamous relationships, and people can make whatever arrangements they want, but they should be very, very responsible, and they should not be. I don't think we should cheat on someone without them knowing about it, because if we're still having sex with them and we have sex on the side, we could be giving them an STD, and I think that is an ethically wrong thing to do. So husbands and wives may choose to say, okay, we're not going to have sex with each other, but we're going to let each other, have outside lovers, just quietly and discreetly. We're going to choose to do that. But then we're not having sex, the two of us. But I think a triangular relationship is asking for trouble because you don't know who that other person is also having sex with. And so they may, there may be a chain of transmission of STDs back and forth. And so I think for intelligent sexual happiness, we should not engage in multiple partners when we're actually doing something with those partners that would perhaps transmit STDs. Phone sex is something different because you don't transfer STDs through phone sex. So that's a different kind of thing. Anyway, to get back to my main point, which is whatever our sexual favorites are, whatever our favorite sexual turn-ons are, and however we have acquired them through experience in our early years, we should become completely comfortable with them and completely relaxed with them as a fantasy that we can bring into our consciousness at any time, whether we're having solo sex or partner sex, and allow that fantasy to turn us on and increase our arousal. And that's a good thing. But we have to make friends with the contents of our sexual unconscious. That all of our sexual desires should be allowed to come into consciousness, and we should make friends with them rather than being scared of them. Okay, well, that's enough for now. I know I didn't get around to talking about what I promised to last time, where, in fact, what happened was, once I was an adult, and once I had become psychologically more sexually mature, I was able to get back in contact with my early sexual desires and accept them without shame, and including my desire to be naked and look at the naked body of a woman and who resembled my mother, and let her look at my body. And an occasion where that happened down on the nude beach, where I had sort of the perfect opportunity to relive the childhood fantasy that I never got to act out in my childhood years. And so next time I will tell you what happened in that particular situation. Okay, thanks for listening. Talk to you again soon.